All right, everybody. So in this episode, I want to talk a little bit more about my Game of the Year prospects so far. I figured this would be a good time to do it because we're officially at the midway point of this year. We've already had some incredible games, and honestly, I still think the second half of the year is going to bring some absolute heavy hitters that could completely shake up the conversation. But looking strictly at the games I've had the chance to play so far, there are three that really stand out to me as legitimate Game of the Year contenders. The three games I want to focus on for today are Resident Evil Requiem, Pokopia, and 007 First Light. I'll go through what I loved about each one, where I think each one falls short, and then at the end, I'll tell you which one I think is currently my frontrunner for Game of the Year. With that, let's jump in. All right, so let's start off with Resident Evil Requiem. And before I dive into Requiem, I should probably give a little bit of background on my experience with the Resident Evil franchise. The first Resident Evil game that really grabbed me was actually Resident Evil Biohazard. That was the first game where the series fully leaned into the first-person perspective, and I absolutely loved it. Don't know why, but I'm just a sucker for first-person horror games. Biohazard had that almost Texas Chainsaw Massacre vibe to it, and between that atmosphere, the visuals, and how mechanically terrifying it looked, I knew I had to play it. Looking back now after playing several games in the series, I honestly don't think anyone does survival horror better than Resident Evil. After Biohazard, I played Resident Evil Village, and then I eventually went back and played the Resident Evil 4 remake. I loved every single one of those games, and apologies if you guys can hear some thunder, it just randomly started storming. I loved every one of these games, and I also think this helped me understand a lot more about the Resident Evil lore, and honestly didn't realize just how massive this franchise had become until Resident Evil 9. The thing that immediately caught my attention about Resident Evil Requiem specifically was the dual protagonist system. You have a completely new character in Grace Ashcroft, but you also have the familiarity of Leon S. Kennedy. I honestly think Capcom threaded the needle perfectly here. They found a way to satisfy newer Resident Evil fans like me who fell in love with Biohazard and Village, while also giving longtime fans another chance to spend time with Leon. And that's really a difficult balance to strike, and I think they absolutely nailed it. I don't want to spoil too much of the story, but I thought that Grace was an excellent addition to the franchise. She's an FBI analyst who hasn't spent much time doing actual field work, and because of that, she's constantly feeling like she's in over her head. You can feel that tension. You can feel how terrified she is. She isn't some super soldier that's prepared for everything. She feels vulnerable, and I think that vulnerability actually elevates the horror. Every hallway, every room, every corner, you're expecting something awful to happen. And I absolutely loved that feeling. The horror sections with Grace are probably some of my favorite Resident Evil moments that I've ever played. Graphically, the game is stunning. The RE engine continues to impress me every single time with the lighting, the environments, the sound design. Everything works together to create an atmosphere that's incredibly tense. I especially love the clinic where Grace spends a large portion of the game, and for me, that was easily one of the strongest locations in the entire experience. I know I'm not alone in saying that. The level design was absolutely incredible. The environmental storytelling was fantastic, and the tension never really let up. Then you have Leon. My only previous experience with Leon had been with the Resident Evil 4 remake, and I definitely plan on going back and playing Resident Evil 2 eventually. But I love the contrast between these two characters. Spend time with Grace, you're scared, resources are limited, you're constantly just surviving. Then suddenly, you switch over to Leon, and Leon is just an absolute badass in this game. He's experienced, he's confident, he's seen this nightmare over and over again. He's chasing Umbrella, trying to uncover the truth, and he really serves as the superhero throughout much of this story. I loved how the first half of the game constantly alternated between Grace's vulnerability and Leon's confidence. It kept the pacing fresh and made both characters feel distinct and unique. Now, I will say the game wasn't perfect. For me, the first half was significantly stronger than the second. Once the story shifts back towards Raccoon City, that's where it lost a little momentum for me. Now, don't get me wrong, I still enjoyed playing as Leon, but after Grace temporarily leaves the picture, you spend a long stretch playing almost exclusively as Leon. And during that time, you're exploring much larger areas, looking for clues, finding artifacts, trying to figure out where Grace had been taken. It becomes much more open-ended. And personally, I actually preferred Grace's sections. Her levels felt more focused, every room felt handcrafted, every hallway kept me on edge because I never knew what was right around the corner. And Leon's sections were fun, but they felt a little bit more like searching for collectibles and progressing to the next objective instead of soaking in the environment. Overall, I absolutely loved Resident Evil Requiem, and if you know me, you know I don't usually really enjoy long games. This one took me roughly 12 to 13 hours to finish, but for a survival horror game, in my opinion, that's perfect. It never overstayed its welcome, it constantly kept my attention, and honestly, that's becoming harder and harder for me these days. After working a full-time job, by the time I sit down to game, I just want something to completely unplug. And sometimes that's actually to my detriment. I'll get tired, I'll lose focus, or I'll lose patience waiting for slower story moments to pay off. Resident Evil Requiem never really had that problem, at least not for me. It balanced horror, action, story, and the switching between Grace and Leon was so well done that I stayed invested from beginning to end. I also think it did a fantastic job on bridging the gap between longtime Resident Evil fans and newer fans like myself. If they continue using this dual protagonist approach for future characters, I honestly think they have something really special. Out of every Resident Evil game I have personally played, this one is my favorite. Alright, so now let's talk about Pokopia. This was honestly a game I wasn't even sure I was going to like, frankly, because I'm not a huge fan of Animal Crossing, and I've never been a really big Stardew Valley fan either. I've always appreciated cozy games. They've just never been my genre. I was actually listening to Ralph, better known as SkillUp, and he made a point that actually really resonated with me and stuck out. He talked about how Pokopia is much more task-oriented, and I realized that's exactly why it clicked with me specifically. With games like Animal Crossing or Stardew Valley, I sometimes feel like they're endlessly playable, but you almost have to create your own fun. You make your own story, you set your own goals, and I know a lot of people absolutely love that. If you're a fan of these games, definitely let me know in the comments because I'd love to know your thoughts because I know I'm the minority there. But for me personally, I always struggled with that style of gameplay, so naturally I didn't think Pokopia was going to be for me. What surprised me was how quickly my opinion changed. Pokopia has all those cozy elements, but it also constantly gives you direction. It always has another objective, another Pokemon to discover, another area to restore, another task to complete. That constant sense of progression is what kept me hooked. If I had to describe it, I would say it's that addictive exploration of Minecraft with the cozy charm of Animal Crossing. And then it lets you experience the Pokemon world from a completely different perspective and a different lens. There's no battling, there's no trying to become a champion, you're simply living alongside the Pokemon, and honestly, I can't believe Pokemon hasn't done something like this before. The premise is actually really interesting. You play as a Ditto that's lost its human, and along the way you meet Professor Tangrowth, who explains that the world has essentially become uninhabitable for Pokemon. Humans have left, the land has dried up, everything feels abandoned. Your mission is to restore the world and make it livable again so Pokemon can begin returning. Right at the beginning, you find a squirrel that's literally drying out because it's so dry in the environment. You splash water on him, and he comes back to life. And that becomes the catalyst for the entire adventure. From there, you're restoring grasslands, creating lakes, planting vegetation, and slowly bringing back each habitat to life. And as you improve each habitat, more Pokemon return. And I will also mention that you do gain abilities as the Ditto because you're absorbing their capabilities. Like, for example, with Squirtle, you get the water gun capability that Squirtle has so that you can rehydrate the area. And when you do resettle into those habitats and they get reborn again, they settle into those areas, those new Pokemon that come back, and they create little communities, little new communities. And little by little, the world starts feeling alive again. And what I love most was how every single thing you did contributed towards progression. You're helping the Pokemon, completing quests, building things, buying items, making different Pokemon happy, discovering new species, restoring the Pokemon Center. Every task pushes you forward. Every session feels productive. And because of that, I always had one more thing I wanted to accomplish before logging off. It's not a completely open world game. It's more made up of large open zones. And honestly, I loved that structure. I think it worked perfectly. This became one of those games that I literally could not stop thinking about. I'd be sitting at work thinking about what area I wanted to restore next, wondering what Pokemon I hadn't discovered yet, looking forward to getting home and playing. And when I checked my playtime, I was around 50 hours. And at that point, I only owned the game for about 2 to 3 weeks, which is absolutely insane for me. Especially with everything else I have going on in my life, with travel and work, it's crazy that I was able to dedicate that much time to this game. But if that doesn't tell you how addictive this game is, I don't know what will. What's funny is, Pokopia was actually the game that convinced me to buy my Switch 2. I had been holding off. I wasn't sure if I wanted to spend the money. I was worried Nintendo might increase the price, and ironically, that's exactly what happened. But luckily, I was able to get out in front of that, because not long after buying mine, the base model went up by a roughly $50, I think. So looking back, I'm actually really glad I picked one up when I did, but Pokopia was that pushing factor, that reason. I've been watching a lot of YouTube videos, watching social media clips, reading impressions, and everywhere I looked, people were constantly talking about this game. I couldn't stop thinking about it. And eventually I just said, all right, I have to play this. And I'll be honest, during the first hour, I wasn't completely sold. I actually started questioning whether I'd made the right purchase. I'm a pretty frugal person, and I get buyer's remorse really quickly. So I started wondering if I'd wasted my money. Then, everything clicked. Within another 30 minutes, I was completely hooked. Suddenly understood why everyone was talking about it. I couldn't put it down. It became one of those games where I'd intentionally make time before bed just to play another hour or two. I honestly don't think that happens very often to me at all anymore. And usually I game whenever I have free time. So Pokopia became something I actively made time for, and that's a huge compliment. Even now, I would recommend this game to just about anyone. If you already own a Switch 2, honestly, this is a must-play. And if you're someone who is already thinking about buying a Switch 2, this is absolutely one of those games I'd point you to as a reason to go and get it, and as a reason to go out and buy it. Obviously, only if it makes financial sense for you. I know not everyone can justify buying a new console, especially right now in the economy. But if you're a gaming enthusiast like I am, I genuinely think it's worth the cost of admission. Now the best part, we're not done yet. During the recent Nintendo Direct, they announced upcoming Pokopia expansions. One of the biggest additions is the ability to build underwater habitats and spend time alongside even more water-type Pokemon. As someone whose favorite Pokemon has always been Squirtle and loving water-type Pokemon, I'm incredibly excited about this. It launches in August, and I honestly can't wait to jump back in because there's more Pokemon, more exploration, more items, more areas to restore, and more reasons to revisit a game that I already loved. And what's funny is I'm not really a DLC person. Normally I finish a game and move on because there's just so many games that are coming out and releasing every year. But Pokopia is one of those rare exceptions. I absolutely plan on coming back, and I'll be there day one. Honestly, I can't wait. All right, so the last game I want to talk about is 7 First Light. Earlier this year, I actually did an episode covering the games I was most excited for in the first half of the year, and this was one of those that I called out. The game is developed and published by IO Interactive with the backing of Amazon MGM Gaming, and IO Interactive is behind the legendary Hitman series. So right away, I knew it had a great developer behind it. Pair that with one of the most legendary franchises in entertainment, and my expectations were very high. I've talked before about growing up with the Nintendo 64. GoldenEye 007 is still one of those favorite games that I can recollect from back then, and just a super nostalgic game for me. So going into this, I already knew that I had a soft spot for James Bond. I was excited to see what the creators of Hitman could do with this iconic character and this IP. From the very beginning, this game feels incredibly cinematic. It's very story-driven, very linear, very action-heavy, and honestly, I loved that. But what really surprised me was how much DNA from Hitman made its way into the game. There were stealth mechanics, social stealth, opportunities to manipulate your environment, bluff your way through conversations, listen to NPCs and use that information in later conversations to make sure that you don't get caught. And again, I knew that there would be some Hitman-like elements, but I wasn't sure how they were going to actually bring it to life with the James Bond IP. But I think all of the combination worked really, really well. And at this point in my life, I honestly don't care about graphic fidelity. Sure, it's, great graphics are always nice, but I'd much rather have something that's simply fun, and First Light absolutely nails that. And I'd also be remiss to not mention Watch Dogs, because there's a lot of Watch Dogs mechanics built into this game that were definitely taken from inspiration of those games. And Watch Dogs 1, at least, was one of my favorite games not growing up, but that I've played in recent history. I also really enjoyed the direction they took with Bond himself. I was a little skeptical here, but instead of jumping in with an experienced super spy, you're watching Bond become that super spy, that person. He's talented, he's confident, but he's still learning. You actually spend some time at the academy to brush up on your skills, and you also meet characters who become incredibly important later in the story. Then you're eventually pulled into a mission involving multiple 00 agents, and from there, the story branches out in something much larger. I thought that was a really fun way to tell Bond's origin story, and it made me care about him much more than I expected. I also thought the voice acting across the board was excellent, top-notch. And I'll admit, I was a little skeptical going in because Daniel Craig wasn't involved. But honestly, I'm glad they decided to create their own version of Bond, and it lets these games establish their own identity instead of trying to imitate the films. All right, quick discussion point as a sidebar. Pierce Brosnan is my James Bond. I know everybody has their Bond, and honestly, I think it's tied to mostly who was the first Bond character that you grew up watching first. And for me, that's Pierce Brosnan. Between GoldenEye and all those movies, that's always going to be 007 in my mind. But I'm curious, who's yours? Let me know in the comments, because I feel like everybody has a different answer depending on when they grew up and the Bond that they gravitated to specifically. But getting back to the game, I thought they absolutely nailed Bond's personality, because he's charming, he's witty, he's confident without feeling arrogant, he's flirty, he's intelligent, and he's constantly thinking his way through situations. Throughout the story, I actually cared about what happened to him. I cared about the relationships he built. I cared where the story was taking him, and I really appreciated that the game stayed fairly linear, because personally I enjoy games that have a focused story to tell. Sometimes open world games can just lose me, and this one never did. Another thing I thought was really interesting was one of the underlying themes involving artificial intelligence. Without spoiling anything, the game explores what happens when someone uses advanced technology to gain an advantage. And honestly, it feels incredibly timely. We live in a world where AI and Gen AI are everywhere. Every day there's another headline, another product, another announcement. So it's funny seeing a game that's been in development for years just feels so relevant when it finally released. What ultimately makes First Light stand out for me is the complete package. The characters, the voice acting, the cinematic presentation, the stealth mechanics, the Hitman influence, the Watch Dogs style manipulation, as I mentioned. Even a little bit of that Uncharted style pacing and gunplay was at large here, which was really cool to see that amalgamation come together. Again, it all comes together to create something that's just incredibly fun. It's a type of game where you can kick back, relax, enjoy the ride, and it's also one of those games that's genuinely entertaining to watch. My husband actually sat and watched me play a good portion of it, and he's usually not someone who's interested in watching me play games. I think that says a lot about how cinematic this experience really is. And if you own a console or a PC, I highly recommend jumping into this. I honestly would recommend this one for nearly everyone, so please go and check this one out. I really hope IO Interactive continues to support this moving forward as well, whether that's DLC, new missions, additional stories. I'd happily jump back into this world, because this one's in particular I would absolutely recommend. All right, so out of these 3 games, which one is my front runner right now? Honestly, this was a really difficult decision for me, because all 3 held my attention. All 3 introduced mechanics that made them each feel distinct and unique. And all three are games I could easily see myself revisiting in a few years because replayability is something that's really important to me. And I may not replay the games immediately, but I love looking back on games that left a lasting impression. Every one of these did that. But if I had to pick one, I would pick Pokopia. The biggest reason is that it took one of the biggest franchises in gaming and completely reimagined what a Pokemon game could be. Instead of focusing on battling, it focused on simply living alongside Pokemon. It became this cozy life sim that somehow still felt incredibly addictive. It also hit every single nostalgic note for me. Right away, I get Squirtle, one of my all-time favorite Pokemon. It brings back so many first-generation Pokemon while also introducing new Pokemon from later generations that I wasn't as familiar with. Every new area made me wonder, what Pokemon am I going to find next? That sense of discovery never really went away, and it reminded me a lot of Minecraft. You'd climb that one hill, you'd see another biome, wander over, and suddenly find an entirely new area full of opportunities. I also loved the underlying message. You're rebuilding the world, restoring nature, helping Pokemon thrive again. There isn't any battling, as I mentioned, no champion path, and it's simply about creating a better world for Pokemon to live in. And honestly, I found that incredibly refreshing. If I had to sum Pokopia up in one sentence, I'd say it combines the exploration of Minecraft, it has the cozy charm of Animal Crossing, but then it has the nostalgia of classic Pokemon. And it amalgamates into one experience that feels completely fresh. But that's this week's episode, folks. I wanted to keep things fairly relaxed and just share my thoughts now that we've officially reached the halfway point of this year. I also want to give a quick shout out to a couple games I didn't get to spend as much time talking about. Mouse PI for Hire absolutely deserves recognition, and so does Crimson Desert. And I've played both. I actually haven't finished Crimson Desert yet simply because it's such a massive game and there's so many other games coming out, but I can absolutely appreciate what it's doing and it has found its audience. I know both of those games are going to be Game of the Year contenders for a lot of people. I just wanted to focus today on those three games that personally stood out to me the most. Overall, I think we've been incredibly lucky with the quality of games we've gotten this year, and honestly, I don't think we're done yet. September alone is stacked with games I can't wait to play. But now I want to hear from all of you. What's your game of the year so far? What game are you looking forward to most during the second half of the year? Do you think anything's coming later this year that's going to knock these three off the list? Have you played any of these games? And one last question. What games are you currently playing, or what's a game you can't stop thinking about? I genuinely love reading the comments because they help me discover new games, and they also give me ideas for future podcast episodes. As always, thank you all so much for listening. Please like and subscribe, share with a friend. I really do appreciate you guys listening this far to this podcast. This has been a really fun experience for me. And as always, please stay safe. Stay gaming, stay positive, and I'll catch you all in the next one.